The chaperone's shadow was the absolute proof of respectability by preventing the inseparability to bring a social death sentence. Our first rule is perhaps the most fundamental, the bedrock upon which the entire precarious structure of Regency society was built. It is the simple, absolute, and non-negotiable law that an unmarried lady of good breeding could never, ever, under any circumstances, be alone with a gentleman who was not a close relative. To our modern sensibilities, this seems merely quaint, perhaps a little overprotective. To a Regency mind, it was a matter of life and death. A lady's reputation, you see, was her entire fortune. It was more valuable than property, more important than her dowry, more essential than her health. It was a fragile, gossamer thing, and once tarnished, it could never be restored. And the easiest way to tarnish it, to utterly destroy it in a single irrevocable moment, was to be found unchaperoned. It didn't matter if the encounter was innocent. It didn't matter if not a single improper word was spoken, not a single inappropriate glance was exchanged. The mere fact of the opportunity for impropriety was enough to condemn you. A lady and a gentleman, alone in a room, or even in a secluded part of a garden, for more than a few fleeting minutes, the assumption was immediate, and it was always the worst possible one. The chaperone was the living embodiment of this rule. She was a constant presence, a human shield against the merest hint of scandal. Usually an older married woman, a mother, an aunt, a paid companion. Her job was to be a silent, watchful guardian at every ball, every party, every trip to the theater, every promenade in the park. Her presence was the social signal that everything was proper, that the lady in her charge was protected, her virtue unassailable. To slip away from one's chaperone, even for a moment, was a catastrophic gamble. Imagine a young lady at a bustling ball. She is introduced to a charming gentleman. They share a dance. He suggests a breath of fresh air on the terrace. If she agrees, and they step outside, into the cool night air, away from the watchful eyes of the ballroom, she has just placed a loaded pistol to the head of her social standing and pulled the trigger. Even if they only discuss the weather, even if they stand a respectable 5 feet apart, should they be seen by a gossip-monger, and the ballrooms were filled with them, the story would be all over London by the next morning. Did you hear? Miss Austen was seen alone with Mr. Darcy on the terrace at the Netherfield ball for a full 10 minutes. The implication would be clear: an assignation, a clandestine meeting, a compromise of her virtue. The consequences were swift and brutal. Her reputation would be in tatters. Other ladies would shun her. Invitations to respectable houses would cease. Her marriage prospects, which were the sole determinant of her future security and happiness, would evaporate. She would be branded as fast or forward, a fallen woman, all for the crime of seeking a moment of quiet conversation. The gentleman, of course, would likely suffer little more than a few winks and nudges from his friends. The double standard was as rigid as the rule itself. It was the woman who paid the price, always. This rule extended beyond the ballroom. A lady could not receive a male visitor at home without her chaperone present in the room. She could not go for a ride in a gentleman's carriage alone. The only exception is if the carriage was an open one and they were accompanied by a groom. The logic was that in an open carriage, in full view of the public, no mischief could occur. A closed carriage, however, was a private room on wheels, and to enter one alone with a man was tantamount to announcing your own ruin. This wasn't just about preventing impropriety. It was about preventing the suspicion of it. Society was not a court of law. There was no presumption of innocence. There was only the tyranny of appearances, and under this rule, the appearance of innocence was impossible to maintain without a constant, vigilant guard. The chaperone chateau was not a comfort, it was a necessity for survival.
The geometry of respect. If the constant presence of a chaperone governed a lady's movements, then our second rule governed every single social interaction, from the most casual to the most formal. It was the complex and deeply significant language of bows and curtseys. To us, a nod or a handshake is a simple greeting. In the Regency, a bow or a curtsy was a detailed statement. It was a physical manifestation of your exact place in the social hierarchy. It communicated respect, deference, or disdain with a precision that words could never match. To get it wrong was not just clumsy, it was an insult. Let's begin with the gentleman. A bow was not a simple nod of the head. It was a carefully calibrated gesture. When greeting a social equal, a man might offer a short, crisp bow, a slight inclination of the head and shoulders, simple, respectful, acknowledging a peer. However, when greeting a superior, a nobleman, a senior officer, or royalty, the bow became deeper and more elaborate. It would involve a sweep of the leg, a flourish of the hand, and a much more profound inclination from the waist. The degree of the bow was directly proportional to the difference in rank between the two men. To give a shallow bow to a duke was an act of insolent pride. To give an overly deep bow to a mere country squire was to make a fool of yourself. The most subtle and dangerous form of acknowledgement was the cut direct. This was the act of deliberately ignoring someone in public. To cut someone was to look them directly in the eye and then look away as if you had not seen them, or indeed as if they were not there at all. It was a brutal public declaration that the person was beneath your notice, that they had been socially excommunicated. It was a weapon wielded by the arbiters of society, like the famous dandy Beau Brummel, to enforce their unwritten laws. To be cut by a prominent figure could signal the end of your social career. For the ladies, the curtsy was their equivalent art form. Like the bow, it was a gesture of infinite nuance. A young, unmarried girl meeting an older, married woman would perform a deep, deferential curtsy, sinking low to the ground in a display of youthful respect. The married woman, in return, would offer a much smaller, more graceful inclination, acknowledging the gesture. When presented at court, a young lady's curtsy was the culmination of months of practice. It was a deep, sweeping, and incredibly difficult maneuver, performed while managing a heavy gown and a headdress of ostrich feathers. A clumsy curtsy before the queen was a moment of profound humiliation. But the real complexity came in the day-to-day encounters. A lady walking in Hyde Park would have to make dozens of split-second calculations. Who should she curtsy to? Who should she merely nod to? The rules were dizzying. You curtsied to those of higher rank. You nodded to acknowledge friends and equals. But what if a friend was walking with a stranger of higher rank? Did you curtsy to the stranger and nod to the friend in one fluid motion? The most important rule for a lady was that she must never acknowledge a gentleman first in public, unless they were very well acquainted. She had to see him, register his presence, and then pretend she hadn't, waiting for him to make the first move. It was a delicate, nerve-wracking performance, repeated every single day. This geometry of respect was a constant public test of your breeding, your knowledge, and your place. It was a silent conversation that everyone was having all the time. A misstep, a forgotten bow, a clumsy curtsy, an improperly acknowledged greeting could cause deep offense, mark you as an ignorant outsider, and slam doors that you didn't even know you were knocking on. The paper ambassador. In a world without telephones or email, how did one manage a social life?
The answer lies in our third rule, a system so complex and laden with hidden meaning that it governed the entire social calendar of the upper classes. I am speaking of the calling card. A calling card was not merely a piece of paper with your name on it. It was your ambassador, your representative, your social footprint. It was a small, engraved card typically bearing your name and sometimes your address or club. For a gentleman, it was simple. For a married woman, it would bear her husband's name, Mrs. George Darcy. An unmarried woman would have her name printed below her mother's on a shared card. These small objects were the currency of social interaction. The ritual of making calls or paying visits was a cornerstone of Regency life, particularly for the ladies of the ton, the fashionable high society. A lady would spend her afternoons being driven around London in her carriage, stopping at the homes of her acquaintances. She would not, in most cases, actually expect to see the person she was calling on. The goal was simply to leave her card. The ritual was precise. The carriage would pull up. A footman would hop down, take the lady's card, and knock on the door. He would hand the card to the servant who answered. This act alone was a message: I have paid my respects. But the true meaning was in the details. If the lady you were calling on was at home and wished to see you, you would be invited in for a short visit, never lasting more than 15 minutes. If she was not at home, a common polite fiction meaning she was not receiving visitors, you would simply leave your card. And here, the folding of the card became a secret language. Each corner had a meaning. Bending the top right corner meant you had come in person. The top left meant congratulations. The bottom right meant condolences. The bottom left meant farewell if you were leaving town for the season. A footman could deliver a whole conversation without saying a single word, just by handing over a card with a strategically folded corner. The number of cards you left was also critical. A lady calling on another lady would leave 2 cards, one of her own and one from her husband for the master of the house. If the lady of the house had grown-up unmarried daughters, the visitor would leave a card for each of them as well. Receiving these cards was just as complex. A silver tray was kept in the entrance hall of every fashionable home, and the cards left there were a public testament to your social standing. A tray overflowing with cards from important people was a sign of immense popularity. An empty tray was a sign of social oblivion. The most important part of this ritual was the return call. A visit had to be returned within a week. To fail to return a visit was a direct and deliberate snub, a clear message that you did not wish to continue the acquaintance. It was the social equivalent of a slap in the face. This system was used to climb the social ladder and to push others off it. An ambitious newcomer to London society would make calls on as many established hostesses as possible. Whether her calls were returned would determine her fate. If the great ladies of the ton returned her visit, she was accepted. If her card sat unanswered, her silver tray remaining empty, she was rejected. Her London season a failure before it had even begun. The calling card was a tool of immense social power. It was used to initiate acquaintances, to solidify friendships, to offer congratulations, to express sympathy, and, most devastatingly, to end social relationships without ever having to speak a single unpleasant word. It was a world of silent, paper-based warfare.
The tyranny of introduction. We have touched upon this already, but it deserves its own place in our cabinet of horrors. for it is a rule that perfectly encapsulates the rigid, almost paranoid structure of Regency society. A lady could never, ever initiate a conversation with a gentleman to whom she had not been formally introduced. This was not a suggestion. It was an iron law. To break it was to commit an act of such shocking forwardness that it would immediately brand you as a woman of questionable morals and desperate character. Any introduction was a formal, ritualized process. It could only be performed by a mutual acquaintance. Let us say Miss Bennet wishes to meet Mr. Bingley. She cannot simply walk up to him and say hello. She must find a person who knows them both, perhaps the host of the party, Sir William Lucas. She would approach Sir William and express her desire for an introduction. Sir William would then lead her to Mr. Bingley and perform the ceremony. "Mr. Bingley, may I present Miss Bennet?" Note the phrasing. The gentleman is always presented to the lady, not the other way around. This was a sign of respect, implying that the lady was the more socially important party in the interaction, granting the gentleman the privilege of her acquaintance. Once the introduction was made, a whole new set of rules clicked into place. The gentleman could then ask the lady to dance. They could engage in polite, impersonal conversation. But the acquaintance was, at this stage, temporary. It was valid only for the duration of that specific event. If they met again the next day while walking in the park, they were once again strangers. The gentleman would have to wait for the lady to acknowledge him with a slight nod. If she did, it was a signal that she wished to continue the acquaintance. If she did not, he was expected to walk on by as if he didn't know her. The power, in this one specific instance, lay with the lady. But the initial barrier of introduction was absolute. Imagine the sheer frustration. A young woman might see the same handsome, intriguing man at 3 different parties, but if they had no mutual acquaintance to perform the ritual, they were doomed to stare at each other from across the room, locked in a prison of politeness. This rule was a powerful tool of social control. It ensured that the upper classes remained a closed circle. You only met people who were already known and approved of by your existing social set. It prevented unsuitable connections from forming. A young lady of fortune could not be approached by a charming but penniless adventurer because no one in her circle would ever perform the introduction. It also created a world of immense social anxiety. Attending a ball where you knew few people could be a terrifying experience. You would be forced to stand at the side of the room, a wallflower, unable to speak to anyone, waiting and praying that your host might remember you and bring someone over for an introduction. And for a woman to transgress, to take matters into her own hands and speak to a man first, it was social suicide. She would be seen as predatory, as a hunter of husbands. Her reputation for modesty and decorum, her most valuable assets, would be instantly destroyed. She had to be the passive prize, the one who is sought after, never the seeker. The tyranny of introduction was a cage, gilded and elegant, but a cage nonetheless. The Ballroom Minefield. The grand ballroom of a Regency assembly was the epicenter of the marriage market. It was here, under the glittering chandeliers, that young men and women could interact in a socially sanctioned way. But this interaction was governed by our 5th rule, a set of dancing etiquette so strict that the ballroom floor was less a place of romantic fantasy and more a strategic minefield. First, a lady could not simply decide to dance. She had to be asked. She would typically sit with her chaperone and wait. A gentleman wishing to dance would approach, bow, and request the honor. The lady's response was critical. She could, of course, accept, but if she refused, she had to have a very good reason. To refuse a gentleman a dance and then moments later accept an invitation from another was a public and devastating insult to the first man. It was a declaration that he was beneath her, that she found him so disagreeable she would rather sit out than stand up with him. Such an act could create a bitter social enemy. The only polite way to refuse was to claim she was already engaged for that dance, or that she was tired and intended to sit for a while. If she used the latter excuse, she was then obligated to sit out the next several dances to maintain the fiction. For a popular young lady, a dance card was an essential tool. This was a small, decorative card where she would pencil in the names of the gentlemen who had engaged her for the upcoming dances, the waltz, the cotillion, the quadrille. A full dance card was a sign of spectacular success. An empty one was a mark of failure. The most dangerous rule of the ballroom concerned how many times a lady could dance with the same gentleman. To dance with him once was a simple politeness. To dance with him twice was a sign of interest. It was a signal to the room that there was a particular connection, a preference. Eyebrows would be raised, whispers would begin. To dance with the same gentleman 3 times in one evening, that was an unofficial declaration. It was a signal that the couple was on the verge of an understanding, that a courtship was underway. It was a serious statement, and not one to be made lightly. For a gentleman to ask a lady for a 3rd dance was to publicly mark her as his interest, and for her to accept was to reciprocate that interest. If he had no serious intentions, such an act was a cruel game, trifling with her reputation. And to dance 4 times or more? That was a scandal. It was tantamount to announcing your engagement. If no formal announcement followed shortly after, the lady's reputation could be seriously harmed. She had allowed a man to monopolize her, to claim her in public, and he had not followed through with a proposal. She would be seen as having been jilted, her value on the marriage market plummeting. The dances themselves were also fraught with rules. During the intricate patterns of a country dance, there were moments of conversation. But this conversation had to be light, witty, and utterly impersonal. To discuss anything of substance, anything emotional or private, was a breach of decorum. The waltz was a particularly controversial dance. It was the first time that couples danced in a close embrace, facing each other. To many of the older generation, it was shockingly intimate. A young lady had to maintain a sense of modesty, distance, even within the embrace of the waltz, to avoid looking too eager or too comfortable in her partner's arms. The ballroom was a stage, and every dance was a scene in a very public play. Your choice of partner, the number of dances you shared, the way you conducted yourself on the floor, it was all being watched, judged, and dissected by a room full of competitors and critics. One wrong step, and your romantic drama could quickly become a social tragedy. The art of saying nothing at all. In a society so governed by appearances, it is perhaps no surprise that our 6th rule concerns the very words you spoke. Regency conversation, far from being a free exchange of ideas, was a carefully policed art form, with a long list of forbidden topics and a very short list of acceptable ones. The goal was not to communicate, but to perform. The first and most important rule was to avoid what was known as particularity. This meant you should never single anyone out for excessive praise or for criticism. You should never express an overly strong opinion on any subject. Enthusiasm was considered unrefined. The ideal was a cool, detached, and mildly amused demeanor. To be too passionate about anything, be it politics, art, or literature, was to risk looking foolish. For a lady, the list of forbidden subjects was vast. She was expected never to speak of politics. She was certainly never to speak of business or money. To mention any part of the body, even in a medical context, was considered vulgar. A lady did not have legs, she had limbs. To admit to being hungry was unladylike. Her conversation was supposed to be decorative, not substantive. She could discuss the weather. She could offer bland, general compliments on the beauty of the gardens or the quality of the music. She could discuss fashion, but only in general terms. She could talk about the latest approved novel, but to offer a deep critical analysis was to risk being labeled a blue-stocking, an intellectual woman, which was not considered an attractive quality in a potential wife. For a gentleman, the rules were slightly more relaxed, but not by much. In mixed company, he too had to avoid the serious topics of politics and religion. His role was to guide the conversation along pleasant, unchallenging lines. He could tell a witty, but never coarse, anecdote. He could pay a lady a compliment, but it had to be elegant and indirect. To say, "Your eyes are beautiful," was too direct, too personal. Instead, he might say, "The stars themselves would be jealous of the light in this room tonight." It was a language of artifice and insinuation. The greatest conversational sin was to discuss personal matters, to ask someone about their health, their family problems, or their financial situation was an unforgivable intrusion. The entire purpose of polite society was to maintain a smooth, polished surface, and personal struggles were the cracks beneath that surface. You were expected to present a flawless facade to the world, and you were expected to respect the facades of others. This led to conversations that were, to our ears, almost comically bland. A typical exchange at a dinner party might consist of a 10-minute discussion of a recent spell of rain, followed by a lengthy debate on the respective merits of two different carriage routes from London to Bath. It was an art form based on saying as little of substance as possible, as elegantly as possible. To be a good conversationalist did not mean being interesting or insightful. It meant being safe. It meant knowing the rules, staying within the lines, and never, ever saying anything that could possibly cause offense, create awkwardness, or reveal a genuine, messy human emotion. Your words were not your own. They were a costume you wore to fit into the polite world. The public promenade. The rules of etiquette were not confined to the ballroom and the drawing room. They followed you out into the open air. Our seventh rule governs the highly ritualized act of the public promenade, the daily parade of the fashionable world in London sparks. Between the hours of 4 and 6 in the afternoon, it was the custom for everyone who was anyone to see and be seen in Hyde Park. Ladies would ride in elegant, slow-moving open carriages. Gentlemen would ride on horseback or stroll along the paths. This was not about exercise, it was about exhibition. A lady's conduct during this parade was, as always, under intense scrutiny. She could not simply look around at the crowds. She was expected to maintain a serene, slightly detached expression, looking straight ahead. To stare at a passing carriage or to crane her neck to get a better look at a handsome horseman was to appear curious and ill-bred. When an acquaintance passed, the complex dance of acknowledgment would begin. A gentleman on horseback would raise his hat and bow from the saddle. A lady in a carriage would offer a graceful nod. As we've discussed, the lady had to wait for the gentleman to greet her first. If he did, she could acknowledge him. If he did not, she had to pretend she had not seen him, even if they had been looking directly at each other. The act of walking was also governed by rules. A lady would never walk alone. She would be accompanied by her chaperone, another lady, or perhaps a brother. She was expected to walk at a slow, graceful pace. To hurry was undignified. She was not to carry parcels, as that was the work of servants. If a gentleman acquaintance stopped to speak with her, the conversation had to be brief. To stand talking in a public park for more than a few minutes was to create a spectacle. And under no circumstances could a gentleman join a lady on her walk without a specific invitation. To turn and fall into step beside her was an act of aggressive familiarity. Even the side of the street you walked on was a matter of etiquette. The gentleman always walked on the outside, closer to the curb. This was a tradition born of practicality. It placed him in the path of splashing mud from passing carriages and the contents of chamber pots that might be emptied from upper windows. It was his job to shield the lady from the grime of the street. This daily promenade was a crucial part of the social season. It was where you showed off your new carriage, your new horses, your fashionable new clothes. It was where you kept track of who was in town, who was courting whom, and who was on the verge of a scandal. It was a place of casual, friendly interaction that was, in reality, as rigidly choreographed as a formal ball. Every nod, every glance, every brief conversation was a move in the great game of society, played out for all the world to see. The ritual of the table. To be invited to a dinner party in a grand Regency home was a sign of social acceptance. But accepting the invitation meant submitting yourself to our 8th rule, the labyrinthine etiquette of dining. A mistake at the dinner table was a very public form of humiliation. The ordeal began before you even sat down. The host and hostess would have spent hours agonizing over the seating plan. This was a matter of immense strategic importance. Rank was the primary consideration. The most important female guest would be seated to the right of the host, the most important male guest to the right of the hostess. The rest of the guests would be arranged in a descending order of social standing. To place a baronet below a simple knight was a grave insult. Couples were never seated together. The goal was to mix the guests and encourage conversation. But this created its own anxieties, as you might find yourself seated next to a complete stranger for a 3-hour meal. Once seated, the table itself was a landscape of potential errors. There would be a bewildering array of silverware, a different fork for fish, a different knife for meat, a different spoon for soup. Using the wrong one was a clear sign that you were not accustomed to fine dining. The rule was to start from the outside and work your way in. But in a moment of panic, it was an easy mistake to make. Conversation, as we know, was a minefield. At the dinner table it was even more so. You were expected to divide your attention equally between the person on your left and the person on your right, turning from one to the other between courses. To ignore one of your neighbors was a terrible breach of manners. The food itself presented challenges. You were expected to eat everything with a fork and knife. To touch food with your hands, even a piece of bread, was considered common. Bread was to be broken, never cut, and lifted to the mouth in small pieces. You were expected to take a little of everything that was offered to you by the servants, but to never ask for a second helping. To do so implied you were not regularly well fed. Wine was served by footmen. You never touched the bottle yourself. A gentleman was expected to pay close attention to the ladies seated near him, ensuring their glasses were never empty. The meal could last for hours with multiple courses. After the dessert, the great gender divide occurred. The hostess would catch the eye of the most senior lady at the table, nod, and then all the ladies would rise in unison and withdraw from the dining room, leaving the men to their port, their cigars, and their manly conversation, which usually meant politics.
The ladies would retire to the drawing room for tea and coffee. The men were expected to rejoin them within an hour. For the men to linger too long over their port was an insult to the ladies, implying they preferred their own company. From the seating plan to the silverware, from the conversation to the ritual of withdrawal, a Regency dinner party was not a relaxing meal. It was a 3-hour public examination of your manners, your breeding, and your social knowledge.
The performance of grief. In a life governed by intricate rules, it is logical that death, too, would be subject to a strict and elaborate code of conduct. Our 9th rule is the complex and often financially crippling etiquette of mourning. When a family member died, society demanded a public and highly theatrical performance of grief. This performance was dictated by a precise set of rules, particularly for the women of the family. The duration and depth of mourning depended on your relationship to the deceased. For a widow mourning her husband, the period of deep mourning was the longest and most severe, 1 year and 1 day. During this time, her life was completely circumscribed. Her clothing was the most visible sign. She was required to wear a dress of plain black wool, completely devoid of any shine or decoration. The fabric, known as bombazine, was chosen for its dull, non-reflective texture. She would also wear a black crepe veil, a long, heavy affair that completely obscured her face when she went out. Every item had to be black: her gloves, her handkerchief, her fan. During this first year of deep mourning, she was expected to live in complete seclusion. She could not attend any balls, any dinner parties, any concerts, or any plays. Her only approved public outing was to church. She could receive only very close friends and family at her home. To be seen to be enjoying oneself in any way was a sign of profound disrespect to her late husband. After the first year, she could transition to half mourning. This period lasted for another 6 to 12 months. She could now put away the dreary bombazine and wear fabrics like silk and velvet, but still only in somber colors: gray, mauve, lavender, and white. The heavy crepe veil could be discarded. She could begin to re-enter society, but only in a very limited way, attending small, quiet gatherings. The rules were slightly less severe for other relationships, but no less precise. Mourning for a parent lasted a year, for a sibling 6 months, for a grandparent 3 months, for an aunt or uncle 6 weeks. Each had its own prescribed timeline of deep mourning and half mourning, and its own specific dress code. This was not just a social burden, it was a huge financial one. An entire new wardrobe had to be purchased the moment a death occurred. For a family with several daughters, the cost could be ruinous. And since death was a frequent visitor in the 19th century, families could find themselves in a near perpetual state of mourning and the associated expenses. For men, the rules were, as usual, far less demanding. A man would wear a black suit and a black armband. He was expected to avoid festive occasions for a few months, but his life and his business were not expected to stop. This performance of grief was not really about personal feeling. It was about satisfying the expectations of society. A widow might have despised her husband, but she was still required to perform the role of the devastated, secluded mourner for 2 years. To fail to do so, to be seen in a colored dress a day too soon, was to invite the condemnation of her entire social circle. It was the final and perhaps the most somber act in the rigid play of Regency life.
The silent confession. Our final rule is perhaps the most fascinating. In a world where a lady's words were so restricted, where her true feelings had to be hidden behind a mask of polite indifference, she was not left entirely without a voice. She had a secret weapon, a tool for clandestine communication, used in plain sight, right under the noses of the chaperones and gossips. I am speaking of the hidden language of the fan. A lady's fan was an essential accessory at any social gathering, but it was more than just a way to keep cool in a stuffy ballroom. In the hands of a skilled user, it was a signaling device capable of conveying a whole dictionary of secret messages. This was a subtle, playful, and sometimes dangerous game. The way a lady held her fan, the speed at which she moved it, the gestures she made with it, all had a specific meaning. Let's say a lady is at a ball. She sees a gentleman she finds attractive across the room. She cannot speak to him, but she can send a message. If she rests her fan on her right cheek, it means yes. If she rests it on her left cheek, it means no. If she wants to tell him, "I love you," she can draw the fan across her eyes. If she wants to say, "I hate you," she can draw it through her hand. The list of signals was long and specific. Carrying the fan in her right hand in front of her face meant, "Follow me." Placing it on her left ear meant, "I wish to get rid of you." Twirling the fan in her left hand meant, "We are being watched." Dropping the fan was a signal of particular interest. It meant, "We will be friends." Fanning slowly meant, "I am married." Fanning quickly meant, "I am engaged." Was this an officially recognized, universally understood language? Probably not to the extent that some romantic novels would have us believe. There was no official school for fan language, but it was a known set of playful conventions, a flirtatious game understood by the fashionable young men and women of the era. It was a small act of rebellion. It was a way for a woman to exercise some small degree of agency in the rigid, restrictive world of courtship. She could express interest. She could discourage an unwanted suitor. She could communicate a warning, all with a flick of her wrist. It was, of course, a dangerous game. If her signals were too obvious, she could be seen as a flirt. If they were misinterpreted, it could lead to awkward or embarrassing situations. But in a world that demanded her silence, the fan gave her a whisper. It was a silent confession, a secret language that allowed the heart to speak when the lips were forbidden to.